Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whatever the case may be. Thank you for joining me. Appreciate you taking a little bit of time to watch this short video. This is going to be the third in my packet tracer series. What we're going to be looking at today are Cisco iOS basics and how to essentially maneuver with inside the different modes inside the Cisco iOS. All right, and getting started with Cisco iOS. What we're going to look at is the command line modes. We've got user exec, privileged, and global configuration. If you'll notice the differences in the way the prompt looks when you're in a different one of the three modes. Router's got the greater symbol for user exec. Privileged is router and a hashtag. And the global configuration is router with a hashtag with an ellipse around config. Now, user exec is used to execute basic commands. Privilege mode is used to show router configuration information, and global configuration mode, when you're in that config mode, is used to make changes and configure your router. In order to switch between these modes, what you're going to need to do is right when you log in, you're going to get the user execute mode. That's going to be the default mode. To get into privileged mode, you need to type in the command enable, or EN for short. To get into global configuration mode, you need to type config T from privileged mode or configure terminal. All right, we're going to get in and work around just a little bit with the three modes in Packet Tracer. Hold on, we'll be right back. All right, and welcome back. We're going to continue from our basic topology Packet Tracer lab, LAB02, and we're going to move on to LAB03. LAB03, we're going to start with that basic Packet Tracer topology. There it is, basic topology. That's the one I was looking for. So here's the basic topology that we started with. I'm going to make sure that I'm just going to do a quick peek. Looks like that one's offline. I need to get that started up. There we go. It's coming online. So this is our basic topology. Now, the command line options and switching between command line modes that I just reviewed, we've got three different modes. User exec, privileged, and global configuration mode. So I'm just going to just jump into this router right here, jump to the command line, make that a little bit bigger. And when you first start up your router, it's going to say press return to get started. I'm going to go ahead and hit return there. And we are automatically in user exec mode. You notice the router with the greater than sign in the command line window. This is used to execute basic commands. To switch between the two, additional command line modes. To get into privileged modes, you type in enable. And if you'll notice, it switches to a hashtag at the end of router. And this is to show the configurations of a router. And then to make changes to that router or to configure the router, we need to get into global configuration mode. And that is done with, let's see, configure terminal. And if you notice, it changes to a router with config and ellipses and a hashtag. So to get out of these, exit. We'll get you all the way exit or end. So if I go back into enable and then config T are the shortcuts, I can do end, and it's going to step back out as well. And then here is a little quirk. The routers are configured to attempt to resolve a name depending upon where you are in the command line modes. And so what it's doing right now is trying to resolve the word end. And so you can use end to get out of the config T or the global configuration mode. But if you try to use it from the privilege mode, it's going to try to provide name resolution. This just takes some time to time out, unfortunately. Now, there is a command, which I'm going to show you here in just a second. I'm going to pause this and let this finish out. It does take some time. All right, it's finally timed out. And if you notice, it says translating in unknown command or computer name or unable to find computer address. So it's trying to use DNS, which it's not configured with, to resolve the name. So we're going to turn off DNS lookup here real quick. And in order to do that, we need to configure. So we need to get into the global configuration mode by using a configure terminal, or for short, config T. And I'm simply going to do a no IP domain lookup. I'm going to go no IP domain TAC lookup. And then I'm going to end to get out of config mode. And if you know now, when I hit end, it simply comes up with don't know what to do. So exit all the way back out to the user exec mode. So just to recap, we're going to do enable. I'm going to do en. I'm going to hit the tab key to finish out the command. I'm going to do a config T tab to finish out the command. And so to back out, you will want to do an exit and an exit all the way back to user exec mode. So what kinds of things can you do in these modes? So I'm going to jump into privileged mode. I'm going to do a enable. And you can show the configuration. So this is where all your show commands are going to come up, like show running config. This shows you all of the settings for the router in the config file. Now there's a couple different config files. There's running config and startup config. Running config shows all of the configuration settings from boot, as well as from boot or from start, as well as any configuration changes you've made since the device started. That is running config. The startup config is what it uses to initialize the iOS. And so anything in this configuration file that I've modified, such as the, let's see if we can find it here, the no domain lookup. Let's see. It's going to be in here. There we go. That's the command I just typed in. Now, the difference between running config and startup config is simply put, unless I save the configuration file, when I restart it, that will go away. So I'm just going to reboot this device real quick. I'm going to turn it off, turn it back on. And when it comes back up, we're going to do that same command, show running config. And if you'll notice, the no IP domain lookup command will no longer be saved in that configuration file. There we go, return to get started. And I'm going to go back into enable and show, and I'm going to shortcut this, show run, and hit a tab. And if you'll notice, that should be in this first page or two. That command is no longer there, the no IP domain lookup. I want to put that back. So I need to go into the global configuration mode. no IP domain lookup. There we go. And if I exit out, go back to the privileged mode and do another show running config, it's added back that command for me. So just real quick, with the difference between running config and a startup config. Now, we also have the show run. Remember, that's the shortcut of show running. Gives you the same information. We can also show other things, like we can look up the version. So show version, I've shortened that a little bit more. This shows the version of the software that you're running and some other disclaimer information and some serial number IDs about your device. Now, you can also use the show command to look at your interfaces. Show interfaces, or show int for short. Now this is going to give you, if you notice, let's see here. Let me make that a little bit bigger. So fast Ethernet 00, fast Ethernet 01. I'm on router 0 here. If I hover, these are my interfaces. You can see in the drop down. And it's giving all of the statistical information for it. If you just want to know some basic information about your interfaces, there's a shorter command, which is show IP interface brief. Now let me give you the full command. So it's show IP interface brief. And if you'll notice here, what we've got, make that all one page, it shows all of my interfaces, whether I've got an IP address assigned, what the protocol is doing, if it's up, if it's down, if it's in an OK state. That's essentially what you're going to get when you drop this hover on it. A little bit different information in the hover, but you do have some of the same information, like whether the link is up or down, the interface name, and whether it's got an IP address set. Some of the same information is seen in both screens. Now I'm going to give the long show interface again. Let's say you get in here at the more, you can press your enter key to go one line at a time, or your space bar to go a page at a time, or your escape key to exit out of the output. Now, some of the other privileged commands that we can do show flash and look at the flash memory, how much memory is being used by what file, what's used, what's available, and how much total system flash is available on the device. If you're having issues where maybe a config won't load, or you can't append to your config file, or your device isn't functioning properly, just like any other operating system, it requires free space. Just like you look and see if you had plenty of free space on your primary partition in Linux, or your primary partition like your C drive in Windows. This is your available memory, your available storage. You can also look at the file system. And it shows the flash memory and the non-volatile RAM, the NVRAM. And then to get into configuration mode, if we wanted to make a change, let's say, for example, we want to, where's that connected? FA0. We want to turn on FA0 and give it an IP address. So let's go to config T. And we're going to configure that interface FA00. So once we're in configuration mode, we need to switch to configuring the interface. So I'm going to do the interface command, and then the first part, fast Ethernet 00. And I want to turn it down on, so I do a no shutdown. And if you'll notice what happens over here, as soon as I enter that command, we're going to go green. It's going to tell me the line has come up. And then we're going to give it an IP address, and it's going to be IP address, and we're just going to give it any random address, 192.168. Nothing set. So 192.168.1.1, and we're going to give it a Class C subnet mask. We're going to go over this in more detail. But now that we've given it that address, when I hover, so I've got an IP address there. And if I back out one, I'll back out one more time and do a show IP interfaces brief. If you'll notice now, the status is up. The protocol is up. I've got an IP address. And you'll notice administratively down is the other state. If I was to jump in, I'm just going to turn that port on manually. I'm going to jump to this port. I'm going to turn it on with a checkbox. If you notice, it tells us what the command is when we use the GUI there. And even though it doesn't have an IP address, exit out of that, exit out of that. It does not have an IP address, but it is administratively up. In other words, I've turned that on. Now, I don't want to make any configuration changes. This is really just to get in and use the commands. And so what I'd like you all to do is get in, work through the different options, go through some of the show commands, get in and out of the different configuration modes, and take a look at the options that you've got from the command line. But once again, since I don't want to save it, I'm simply going to turn this router off, turn that router on, and we're going to give it a few moments here. Notice it's trying to boot up. And I'm going to select no there. Run the copy command and copy the running config to the startup config from privileged mode. You do a copy running config, startup config, or a copy run start, and save all those changes that you've made to the running config back to your startup config, so that when you do power cycle it, that it saves its settings. So that's a very important step. All right, so now that I'm done, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to do a file, save as, not save as PKZ, but save as. There they are. And so I open this up with and saved it as the PT LAB03, just so I wouldn't overwrite my basic topology. Now, when I'm done with the lab, I'm going to save it as LAB03 complete. Some of the labs that we will do, we will reuse a specific lab file through 2 or 3 different labs. Make sure you retain your old files in the state that you had them when you finish the lab. So you should always have a beginning and an end lab file as we work through this packet tracer. It'll just be easier if you make a mistake and have to start over again. All right, and thank you for spending just a little bit of time taking a look at getting started with the Cisco IOS. Thanks for watching.